Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. Today I am bringing you a video in Unreal Engine 5.3.1. They overhauled the enhanced input system and they basically wiped everything you could do before to do key bindings, so it's all completely brand spanking new. The good thing is it's significantly easier to do than it was ever before. So let's go ahead and jump right into the tutorial. If you're an advanced user and you've already got a bit of a key binding system left over from the old system, I will say that there are some minor changes you can make. Down below, I should have the chapters. If you want to jump to the part you're stuck at, you should be able to find that there. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So what you're going to want to do first is open up your project settings. Let me actually do that right here. And you're going to want to go ahead and find your enhanced input section. It's under Engine. And inside of here, there's something called user settings. Make sure to check mark that. By default, it's check marked off because this is an experimental feature. But this is basically the new way they want to handle key bindings from now on. So go ahead and check mark that. And you'll have user settings. So let's go ahead and close this. Next, you're going to want to create what's known as input actions. So these are very simple. Use right click, go to input. Inside of here, you've got an input action. Create one or two of these with just some basic details. Usually I put a little action description because then you can add that added to the tooltip. And then you've also got down here you can add player mappable key settings. I wouldn't add them here because we're going to add them somewhere else later on. You'll set what value type it is. For here it's Boolean, so it's breaking system. You just check it and it bools. You can also have axis 1D, 2D, or 3D. Triggers and modifiers, and then any kind of other behavior that you want to do here. But yeah, so let's go ahead and take a look. So once you have your input actions, you're going to want to create something called an input mapping context. What this is basically a grouping of those input actions and allows you to basically contextualize those input actions. And the way they contextualize them is you can have multiple of these. So for example, you got a game where you go from driving a car to running to flying to driving a boat. These would allow you to call different functions based on what you're actually doing. So you can still have certain ones that override everything. They're like the head look, you always want your mouse to be following that. But maybe, there's like for vehicles, you want that head look, but you want to do it differently. So you override the original head look by having it rotate around the vehicle instead of rotating around the player's head, something like that. And so once you create this input mapping context, you can go ahead and add those actions to it. And you basically add whatever actions you want associated with that mapping. And you can also give it a description if you want. I only have the one mapping context, so I didn't feel I needed to add a description. And let's go ahead and look at something like our interact system here. So here I've added two keys. I've got the F key and the game face button. You just hit this add control binding to this action mapping and that does this. So these are your default keys. These are what the system sees as your base keys for this action. And inside of here, when you create these, this is going to be set to inherit settings from action by default. Go ahead and change that to override settings and then select player mappable key settings instead of none, which should be selected by default. When you drop this down, you're going to be given a whole bunch of stuff here. Now it gives you metadata. This allows you to store like images. For example, if you want images associated with the different key bindings, you could absolutely add images here. This is actually a great way so that if you want to add an image for basically interacting, but it's not necessarily like an F for F key, you wanted something that's like a symbol, like a plus or something for interacting, you can add that here. And then whenever you want to reference that, you just show it on screen by accessing the metadata. But what I've gone ahead and done is I added a name and display name for each of these keys. Now the name needs to be unique. By having this be unique, you can then have these be separate keys. If they are not unique, one will override the other as far as I'm aware. So now I've got interact and interact controller so that I can have two separate key systems. I can have a whole system for controller and then a whole system for mouse and keyboard. This is important for me because I want to have players on Steam Decks be able to play my game. And so by having the gamepad be a separate set of key bindings, they can actually edit those keys. I'll show you later, but there is something you do need to select for gamepads to be able to update the actual key bindings. But yeah, once you've got these two things set up, this is the most important part. This will help you see the actual key bindings. Once you've got your actions in here and you've set up at least one key with each action, then what you're going to want to do is you can close this at this point. What you're going to want to do is, if you've got your player pawn, so whatever your default player class is. Now I am doing this in single player, so in multiplayer there are some replications and things you have to do. Because I'm doing enhanced local player subsystem, I believe that there is a slightly different version you need to grab if you're doing multiplayer. But you just go ahead and you get the controller, you cast to that controller, and then grab the enhanced input local player subsystem. This is the actual subsystem that controls your input. You just make sure it's valid, and so long as it's valid, you add a mapping context. That mapping context is that one that we created there, that I am player view. You can give it a priority, so if you want this to be a higher priority over other mapping contexts, you can set that to a higher priority. And you can also put in context options if you want to. I don't necessarily need these, but if you wanted to use these, you can. From here, I just set the player controller as a variable inside of my player, because it's all done on begin play. And then we're going to load the key bindings. Now this is a little bit of a misnomer. We're not actually loading key bindings here. What we're actually doing is taking the player controller and we're grabbing the enhanced input user settings. So that setting we checkmarked earlier. If you didn't checkmark that, this won't work. But we checkmarked that, and this gives us this. And then we grab the input user settings and set it as a variable on the player. This is so that at a later date we can access this from within the player if needed. At the time, I'm not actually accessing it inside the player. So strictly this isn't necessary, but I do believe you have to do this to sort of refresh the input system, because you actually have to take the user input settings and register the input mapping. So you don't necessarily have to set the variable here, but if you don't, then you need to pull this here. But yeah, so once you've set that, you can check if it's valid. If it is valid, then on a branch, you can check if the user settings up here is mapping context registered. So you just check, is I am player view registered? If it's false, go ahead and register it. And that's basically all we need from our player pawn. So now we've got that all set up. You will have to test some of this out. You will have to add, I guess I can show that off real quick. You will want to add, some actions to do. So like print string, something. So like, whatever your enhanced input action is, you can just right click and just do enhanced input action. Oh, I think I misspelled. But yeah, sorry, never mind. You don't need to type in the enhanced input action. You can just type in the name of your enhanced input. So for mine, I put IA underscore and then a name. So you can go ahead and find one of your events and you click here, and that'll create this little thing here. And then from there, you can do whatever you're wanting to do from this side. But yeah, so that is it for the player pawn. Once you've got that all set up, you've also got here what is known as a key binding and then our settings menu. So we'll start with the settings menu since this is sort of the baseline here. And what I've got is I've got 3 buttons up here. You start out on the graphics side, you click key bindings, and that opens up the vertical box here. Inside this vertical box, I've got 2 buttons, keyboard and controller. By default, keyboard is the one that gets started and gets loaded, but you could click on controller, click on keyboard, and it should load the keys down below. And so below it, I've got 2 vertical boxes. Now in theory, you could do this all in 1 vertical box. I prefer to have it right now in 2 because I was working around with the way to categorize different key bindings. Eventually, I think once I get a better handle on constructing different pieces and organizing the key bindings, I'll probably have them all be in 1 vertical box and just add these UI and combat sections as a widget to that. But for now, basically I've gone in and these are some placeholders here, but you don't need to add these. All you need is the vertical box UI, and then if you're replicating this exactly, and then the regular vertical box down below. And then on each one of these, I have that W key binding, as well as I have a button called reset bindings, a button for saving, and a button for going back. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So we're going to start. It's very simple the way I've got this set up. Basically, every time this widget loads on the key binding side, I call it clear and get keys. Or if I'm on the controller side, if I've clicked that controller button, I call clear and get controller keys. And so what this does is it takes all those vertical boxes and it clears all the children that are stored there. Now it does it for both controller and mouse and keyboard, just to make sure that they're empty if there's nothing in there. And then from there, we're going to call get keys controller. And if we've clicked that confirm reset, so that's that reset button down below, I have a confirmation message, and basically if they hit confirm, this calls reset keys, or if they hit the save button, it saves the keys. And we'll walk through all of these here in a moment. But for clear and get keys, this and this work almost identically. The only difference is going to be that the controller one just checks for if the keys are controller keys, versus this one checks if they are mouse and keyboard keys. So starting off, I only have one context, so I basically just have a variable here that stores that IM player view context. If you have multiple, you can create an array and have it, do a for loop over each of the contexts, or you could have it be different screens for different contexts, so players edit them differently at different times. That's how Call of Duty does it. So you have like an infantry context, vehicle context, things like that, and each one is a separate thing. So you could separate them out like that. I just have them separated by keyboard and mouse versus control. But when you have a context, you pull out the mappings and you go through a for each loop of those mappings. And that is going to give you what's known as enhanced action key mapping structure. This is actually the structure of those keys. Now what you do is you're going to take that and you're going to break it out. So you just pull off from here and type in break. You get break enhanced action key mapping, and it's going to give you all of this information. And then we're going to also pull from here. It has to be from here, not from this action. This one does not work, but if you pull it from here and type in get player mappable key settings, this does return the correct information for the override. And then from here, we're going to do two different things. This one pulls off a display category. Now you can skip this step if you're not doing a display category, but I have a display category of a UI. And if my key has that display category exactly, then it's going to go up here and it's going to actually add the child to that UI box, vertical box, instead of the mouse and keyboard vertical box. That way I can have them be two separate vertical boxes. But before we get to that point, what we're going to do is we're going to check if this is a mouse and keyboard key. Now this is a function that I've created. This is a pure function. So if we come in this pure function here, what I do is I pass in the key structure, and then I just check, is this a keyboard key? Is this a mouse button? And is this an Axis 3D? If it's any of those, and it is not a pinch, which is like another way to say zoom in and out. So if it's not a pinch, and it's not a keyboard, mouse, or Axis 3D button, then it's going to return true that it is a mouse and keyboard key. And in the controller, I basically do the inverse. I check if all of those are false. But yeah, so long as that returns true for get keys, it's going to come in here and it's going to actually create that widget. It's going to create the W key binding we're about to go to. And it calls a function on that W key binding called init text. That init text takes in the key mapping data, so that one we were talking about earlier from here. And it passes it into the init text. And this is where it actually gets initialized. So let's go ahead and jump into the key binding now. So inside of this init text, basically what we do is we pass this in and set it as a variable here. Then we get that user input settings again. We get them here instead of passing them in, because I have noticed some inconsistencies if they get passed in. I'm not sure why. I think it's just a bug in the system. I'm not 100% sure, but I just know some weird inconsistencies, so I just go ahead and I just grab them all over again. And I get the enhanced input user settings, and then I just make sure they're registered. And so long as they are registered, then we can actually go in here and we're going to call setup key UI. This setup key UI is called both at the beginning and anytime we refresh a key. Now by default, our system here, so this widget, it's a very simple widget. we have a canvas panel, a size box, a horizontal box, and then key text. This is the actual name of the action. And then we have a spacer, and then a reset button, and then an input selector. So what this lets us do is actually change our key binding. Now when you click on this in game, this will change automatically whichever key you press. But if you hit this back button to reset the key to the default, it doesn't update automatically. That's why we have that refresh key. So this refresh key here will get called anytime that reset button is pressed. So on press reset, we basically do some stuff here and then refresh key. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but we just call it refresh key. This also happens if this function here, this custom event, is called by the settings menu. So in the settings menu, when we reset bindings, that's where we call that. So for every single key binding we're looking at, if we refresh or basically default it back to the default, this is called so that it can default them all. That way you can default just the mouse and keyboard or just the controller. You don't have to default all of them back to the start. So with that, we've got this completed here. And so we've got this setup key UI. So what this does is this is what actually creates the UI elements here. Now I've spaced it all out so it's a little easier to see. You could have it a lot more tightly grouped or even make this a function within a function, but I've just done it like this to make it easier to see. So we come in and we grab our input selector and set it to selected key. Now to make that selected key, we're going to pull off from the selected key and do make input chord. What this does is this takes a key in and then you can combine it with other buttons. So for example, if you want there to be like a button that does shift plus, you could add an additional input selector just for these style keys. I haven't done that here, but in theory you can do that and then you just pull off if that exists and what key it is, so that players could add chords to other keys. But to make the key that goes into here, we're going to do a little bit of trickery. We're going to take that key mapping that we brought in that init text, and we then are going to break that into an enhanced action key mapping and pull off the key there. And when we take that key and then the player mappable key section settings from the key mapping, we're going to take those and first we're gonna pull off and then make map player key args. This allows us to make arguments. What this does is this just takes our key here and creates like a temporary key to say, hey, here's what my key looks like. So we take this, we plug it into new key, make sure it's in the first slot. There are other slots that there you can store more than one key, but I prefer just to have the first slot because we're already separating them at the keyboard and mouse level, or keyboard and controller level. Then off of the get player mappable key settings, we pull off the name, and this is that unique name that we talked about. So when you plug that mapping name in, that means you always have a unique name for that mapping name. That then creates a map player key args, which we then plug into this find key mapping. Now to get to this find key mapping, you take your user input settings, pull off get current key profile. What this does, this gets the current key profile of the user input settings. And then when you pull off, it's going to return an enhanced player mappable key profile object. And basically we're going to plug that in here by just pulling off and typing in find key mapping, and then you plug in the args. From here, you have an out key mapping, and you're going to break that. The reason why you break this is this gives us our actual key mapping that we want our data from. So what this is doing all along, this has been just basically trying to grab the actual player key mapping. So what have we mapped this to? And then what we've got here is we've actually got a default key and a current key. So this would be really handy for when we want to know if our current key was our default key. But before we can do that, so we've done all that, we grab our current key and we're going to plug it into that make input chord that we talked about. And this is all just to set up the input selector, make sure the input selector has the correct key. Once that does, then we're going to come over here and we're going to get our key text. So that is this text on the left side. And we're going to set text. So that set text is going to be equal to the display name, the fancy name that we give. So like, for example, in the one, it was interact for both because you are interacting. So we grab our display name from the player mappable key settings, and then that display name gets plugged into the set text. From here, we're going to drag off a branch because now we want to see if we need to show that back arrow, because we don't want to show this back arrow all the time. We only want to show it if the key is not equal to the default key. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So we create this branch, and we have a boolean here that's being returned, and we just say, is default key equal to the current key? If it is equal to the current key, then we're going to hide the reset, because you can't reset from a default to a default. But if it is not equal, so if there's a different key than expected, so if the players last time they played set a key to something other than the default, then we're going to show the reset key. And all of this is just to set up the key UI. Once that's completed though, now we move on to the actual simpler part of this, which is updating the key on change. So this actually maps the player key. I don't know if you guys have seen it before, but if you've ever done this before, you know that the last time we did this was really long to try and map it. And now it's as simple as this, because they really made it a lot easier in the new version. So what we're going to do is on our input selector, we've got two different things that can be called. They're the on key selected and on is selecting key change. Now those sound a little confusing, but essentially what this means is whenever we actually click a key, this fires. But until then, once you press that button, this will fire over and over and over. But we don't want that to actually remap to blank, because then we just end up with like a blank key over and over and over until we actually enter the key. And that's just not worth I mean, it doesn't do much, but it's better to set it as ease remapping, because then it guarantees that it only fires the one time. And so basically we created a boolean that's set to is remapping false by default. And we set it to true once it's actually key changed. So once that key change actually happens, it will then move on and set that back to false. And then this is where we actually start to do the remapping. So we're going to pull off from our selected key and break our input chord. From here, we just grab the key, and we're going to make map player key args. And this is where we pass in that new key. We pass in the first slot, and then we're going to get our mapping name, which of course, as you probably know by now, we just take our key mapping, break that, and we actually don't need to break it. Sorry, I was misremembering because there's some changes I made. So what we're going to do from our key mapping, just pull off get player mappable key settings, and then from there pull out the name. This name is that mapping name, the unique identifier, and we pass it into there with those other arguments, and that actually is where we're going to create map player key. So we pull up here, just type in map player key, and then you're also going to want to your target is going to be your user input setting, because we're mapping it to the input settings. Once those are both in there, then we're going to actually compare it to the default key to see if we need to show that reset button. So like before, where we did the hidden invisible, if it's default or not, we did the same exact thing here inside of a pure function. I just didn't do it in the other one because I want to show you all more detail about how to do this. But if you understand how to do the other one, you should understand how to do this one by now. But here's a quick view edit if you want to create this function yourself. It's just a pure function. But that'll return a boolean that will then either show or hide the reset button. And then lastly, we have that reset button. If that does get pressed, or if you reset on the settings menu, this is going to call map player key. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pass in the user input settings, and we're going to get the default args. And so the way we do that is just like how we got the default args for the name. We basically do the exact same thing. We just get our key mapping, break it, get the mappable key settings, get the name, do all the normal settings for these args. So first new key and then mapping name. And then we're going to get our input settings and current key profile and find our key mapping. So basically we're looking for what's currently mapped to. And then in here, we break that apart and just grab the default key and make an argument. So this is basically just the mapping name, slot first, and the default key, because we're passing back into it, just saying, hey, take our default key and make this map to it. And once you've done that, you just call the refresh and it'll reset it back to blank. or back to, sorry, not blank. It'll reset it back to the default key. And that is pretty much everything for the widget here. And so now that we've got this, so we've created all of our widgets, we've gotten the keys that we want, we've done pretty much everything. The only thing that's left is going to be the actual savings. So we want to save these keys. As it stands right now with the current version, if you haven't done the saving yet, you can rebind the keys, but when you go to play, and when you go to play, everything will work just fine. They'll work on the rebound keys. The only problem is going to be if you close the game, it doesn't actually save it. It only applied it. So what you actually want to do to actually save the game, or sorry, save the settings of those keys, is you got that save button. When players press that, you're going to call the save settings function. So let's go in here. Inside of here, you can ignore this. This is just for game settings that I'm saving here at the same time because I'm making it all one save button. But essentially just for key bindings, basically you just grab that user input settings and it's as simple as hitting apply settings and save settings. And that's it. That's all you got to do. And boom, you got your key bindings and they should work. So let's go ahead and I'll actually show that to you now. All right, now that it's loaded in, I'd want to give it a second to make sure everything loaded. We can go ahead and go to our key binding section. So you can see here, last time I tested this out, I loaded a bunch of stuff with key bindings, and I can either press these individually and reset them back to the default, or I can hit reset bindings, hit confirm, and that calls that reset, and boom, it resets those all back to the default. And then if I don't hit save, if I go back, exit to menu, let's see if it'll actually do it here, if I actually need to close the game. Okay, so I think I actually closed the game. So let's actually close the game. And see, it's gonna throw an error here. This is because we didn't save here, and I've got this update HUD key. This is basically what this is doing, is looping through. This is one thing you'll want to check. So yeah, so this is the reason why. So on this, you have to actually get player mappable key settings. Originally, I was doing it through the action and found out that this actually is incorrect. This pulls directly from the input action. But if you pull it off of this, this will work just fine. And so if we do that again, we won't get that same error, access none. I want to show you what that would look like in case you missed something when you're updating. So let's go ahead and check now. As you can see, it didn't save our thing because we didn't hit the save button. But let's go ahead and default all but this one back to the default. Hit save, and then let's exit. And then see how we didn't get the error that time? And then we'll hit this. And boom, it is still set to that number 7. Let's actually revert that as well. And then what we can do is if we go to left here, this is where the update HUD is. As you can see, it shows the correct key. Let's go ahead and actually update that here. Let's make this something like the B key. Let's do the B key. Save that, go back. And now it shows the B key. So, as you can see here, so long as you have everything set to the correct player mappable key settings, you should be able to get the correct information you need. And here I am just basically comparing the name, saying, hey, does this have the name of Interact? If yes, then paste it here. So that should be everything. That is a full key binding system now in 5.3.1, and hopefully going forward that shouldn't change. If there's any minor updates or anything, I'll bring you guys back, but otherwise, good luck and good hunting.